Hey y'all! Well, we're back for turntable setup round 2. And I did kind of a basic review of this turntable, but going to go into more just kind of generic turntable setup and care and feeding of your vinyl. And one of the things that I've learned is, especially if you're just starting out, get a couple of really good sounding new vinyl records to kind of set the baseline of what you're trying to do. And I'll put a link in the description to a couple on Amazon that you should probably look at. Any of those new release of Blue Note jazz is like super high quality. It's super clean. There's almost no surface noise. They got a wide dynamic range. Maybe preview a couple of the artists, find somebody you sort of like, and just get one. It's hard to go wrong with Grant Green or some of those other, just classic artists as a baseline for setting up your turntable to know when it's sounding good. It's really hard to figure out like what you're doing with your turntable if you've got a bunch of worn out vinyl you're trying to compare settings and adjustments to. So, step 1, get a good baseline record to play that you know is good quality. Secondly, 2 things you need to use. I do this every time before I play a record. And I do have dog in the house, so there's dog hair and dander and stuff, so all my records need a little dust before we start. First thing, little carbon fiber brush. Hudson Hi-Fi make this one. Several other people make them. They're on Amazon. They're like 15 bucks. They help remove static, and they get the first little swipe of dust and debris off of the vinyl. Next, I follow up with it's an AT6012 little brush. What I like about it is it's curved like this and comes with this record care solution. You don't put this on the face. You don't put it on the vinyl. You just put a couple of drops in these holes here. And I usually do it, once a week or so. I'll put a little fluid in here and it wicks its way in. And this isn't even wet, but it's just not like bone dry. I mean, you can feel a little bit of, not a little bit of moistness on there, but it doesn't leave any of it on your hand when you touch it. You can just feel that it's not bone dry. And then both of these I have with the turntable running, I hope, of course. And then you just kind of go like this, and you give it this rotating motion as you go, and then work out to the edge. And when you're doing this, you're getting a clean surface as it rotates around. And then just kind of get whatever's on your shirt, put it right back in your little holder there, and that helps the moisture not evaporate. That's a great little system that they have. Okay, next. Get a Stylus weight scale. They're not real expensive. And they're nice because they're low profile. You can put them on let me get this dust shield out of the way. So they're nice low profile. When you set them on there, they're not much thicker than the vinyl is, especially if you put the Stylus right on the little cutout dot in the middle. And you can just lift it up, move it over, and turn the scale on, drop it down, and you can see what the weight is. I find 2 grams for most of these AT cartridges works well, but check the Stylus manufacturer and see what they recommend as far as the weight. There's usually a range, and you can experiment with lighter and heavier and see if you hear a difference. I found the middle sounds good to me, and I haven't heard a whole lot of difference going, a 1/10 or 2 of a gram one way or the other. If you're having problems with your needle tracking, obviously you can set it a little heavier and that'll help it track better. But, it's probably going to put a little more wear on your vinyl too, so I don't think it's going to make that much difference though. I will say that these micro line needles that AT makes, they track like a boss. I mean, I've never had one skip. And so, and even their little elliptical cartridge is really, works great. So, either one of those, you're probably not going to have a problem. You set it 2 grams, you're good to go. So, the next thing that I want to go over is keeping the needle clean. It comes with a little brush that is really soft, and you're not going to hurt anything with that little brush. I mean, the bristles are going to move more than the cantilever is, and you're not going to like wreck your cartridge, going like that to clean the needle off with. What I do suggest is getting a little magnifier like this little guy, and this is a lighted one, and it's got 90x, 60x, and 30x. And the 90x one especially, you can really get in there and see the needle and how clean it is and how much garbage is on it. And obviously, you want the needle clean. Anything that's on it is going to cause a problem. And I actually had a problem with one of my cartridges, and I didn't have a magnifier strong enough to see it. There was a little glob of something off to one side of the needle. And some vinyl I would hear like a weird little scratchy noise on the left channel. And then another vinyl, it wasn't there. And I was like, what is going on? Well, what happened was that little piece of crud that was stuck on the needle was sitting on the top of the groove between the grooves, or the peak between the grooves, and it was catching every once in a while, and you get a little sound, and it was because there was some gunk on the needle. So how did the gunk get on the needle, you ask? I will tell you. It was from mistakenly using one of these things. And this is the brand name one, which is the Onal Zero Dust. This isn't a copy clone one. This is like, I said, if I'm going to buy one of these, this is going to last a long time. Let's get the real one. Do not use these things. I know people warn not to do it, and I didn't listen to them. And one of my nice cartridges got all kinds of garbage all over the needle that I wasn't sure I was going to even be able to get off. I ended up having to use some alcohol and really getting pretty aggressive with the little brush to get the stuff off of it. And a chunk of this crap was what was stuck to the side of the stylus that was dragging, making weird noises. Do not use these. I mean, I know some people swear by them, but they're bad news. So what should you use? Well, like I said, the little brush that comes with the cartridge is going to take care of 90% of what you'll ever find stuck to your needle. And, unless you're doing something crazy like, spraying soapy water on your records when you play them, trying to make some old crappy records play good or something, you're not going to get anything on the stylus that's not going to come off with a little brush. But in case you do get in with your little magnifier and you see something that doesn't want to come off, Hudson Hi-Fi to the rescue again. They make this little tool, and I saw a review on YouTube for this. I may see if I can find a link to it and put it in the description, where the guy tests these, which honestly didn't do anything. He had a little carbon brush, which is what this is, on the end of this little thing. And actually, just using the end of this little carbon brush without turning this on can get rid of a lot of goop that may end up on your needle. But if that doesn't work, you take, obviously you take this guy, you take the platter off and you set this directly onto the metal. You put the needle on there, and then and I would probably turn it on before I drop the needle on there. And it comes with a little bottle of fluid to put on there to help break the stuff loose. You don't leave it on there but for, I think, a few seconds. Just follow the instructions. And that will definitely nuke whatever's on your needle without tearing up your cartridge. Okay, so now we've got that done. Let's go over cartridges, needles, and all of that kind of stuff. And the main thing to understand is the stylus itself is probably one of the most critical things about the whole combo. And it makes more difference in the playback sound, I feel like, than even the cartridges do. In an example, this turntable came with this little cheap AT cartridge that had a green plastic little conical cheap stylus in it. I think they're $15. And this nice turntable sounded like garbage with that needle. And I wanted to see, is it the cartridge or the needle? Just how much difference does just the stylus makes? So I bought the elliptical stylus, which was like $100. I didn't buy like the super fancy micro line like this cartridge has in it, but I just wanted to see what one step up. It was huge. I mean, it was like there was no denying that it was a different needle. And I know a lot of this audio stuff is real snake oily and, you know, real subjective and like, did you really hear anything? It's like, it was night and day, guys, going from that cheap conical needle to this elliptical. Now, I don't know how much difference there is between like the elliptical and the micro line or the Shibata, however you pronounce that, you know, the more expensive ones. But I know that going from the bottom tier to the next tier up is a huge difference, even on the same cartridge. So make sure you don't get like the bottom level stuff, because it's not going to sound good. Now on the other end of the coin, you know, you can step up and spend a lot of money on a moving coil cartridge. A lot more money. They're a lot more sensitive to setup. You definitely want to get one that's got a nice stylus, because you can't replace the styluses in a moving coil cartridge. So you're stuck with whatever it comes with. So, you know, if you were going to buy one just to see the difference of a moving coil and moving magnet and said, well, I think I want to get a better one of those, you've got to start all over and buy a whole other cartridge. You can't just buy a different needle for it. It also puts out a lot less signal, and so it's a lot more sensitive to external noise as far as like, you know, cabling and picking up noise like that. And unless your preamp has a setting for a moving coil, you're going to need something like a step-up transformer. And this is the one I got. This has got some Cinemag transformers. It's got some switches here where you can adjust the loading. And on a moving coil, the loading is mostly on the ohms and how much, you know, turns ratio, as far as like, is it 1 to 9? Is it 1 to 18? And that's, you know, like 1 in is 18 out amplification. And 1 to 12 seems to work good with that cartridge with my preamp, which is pretty hot. That said, let's talk about phono preamps. That's something that people don't really understand or put much thought into. And again, I found that that makes probably more difference than anything as far as your turntable setup. And a lot of people just use like the little phono preamp that's built into their turntable, or they use one that maybe is built into their integrated amp and just call it a day. But I found that those just aren't good enough. And a lot of people aren't aware that the analog recording on vinyl is actually compressed audio. That they've compressed the lows and they've expanded the highs, and when you run it through your cartridge to your amplifier, there has to be something that undoes that equalization, or, you know, puts the EQ back in it. It's called RIAA, and it was a standard they developed. The early vinyl, every record company had their own standard, and finally the record industry said, man, you got to stop doing that. Everybody's got to like equalize these things to the same standard. So they came out with a standard a long time ago, and the phono stage is supposed to re-EQ that back to normal. And I just don't think like these little built-in ones that are in the turntable, or, you know, maybe in your integrated amp, they're just barely adequate. Now what I've been using is this tube one that I DIY'd from my Made in China little circuit board. It's got 3 tubes. The kind of tubes make a difference in the way it sounds. Definitely has got just a really rich sound to it that you don't get from even solid state phono stages. Now, there are some decent ones. If you don't want to spend the money to get some crazy tube thing like this, supposedly that company makes, I think it's called a Shit Manny, makes a really nice phono stage for about the bottom price that you're going to spend on one and get something decent. And then there's some other folks that make some solid state ones that are in the $600 to $700 range that sound very similar to what this tube one that I built sounds like, because I've tested various ones of these. But definitely spend some money on getting a nice phono preamp. And this is different than like a preamp. This is like a phono preamp. It's specifically only for use with a turntable. So, the other thing you can get into is different head shells. I like these Yamamoto wood head shells. Another thing to note is, even though these are 2 Technics head shells, they are not identical. This one has a little set screw, and you can adjust the twist on it in the Tonearm to get the needle perfectly straight. This one's got no adjustment. And pretty sure these are both Technics ones, but really, for all I know, this could be a clone. So be careful out there. They're not all the same. And some of them are really heavy, some of them are really light, so you need to take that into consideration on setting up your turntable. Now, there's this whole subject of compliance and virtual Tonearm mass and all that stuff that's too deep a subject to get into this video, but I will say that I've found that turntables sound better, just in general, when the counterweight is closer to the pivot. And there's this whole thing of polar moment of inertia. And that means, when you think about a pendulum, as you get further away from the pivot point, it's got more momentum, and that whole weight and motion tends to stay in motion thing applies. So when you've got the Tonearm trying to track, some variations in the groove like this, if you've got a weight on the end and it's way past the pivot, it's like the dog's tail back there wagging. It's going to cause some weird issues. And I do think, and this might be kind of a controversial viewpoint, but I feel like it's not as much of the total mass, but of where the largest portion of the mass is in relation to the pivot. And to that end, I like adding a little bit of weight to the very end of the Tonearm, and these Technics Tonearms are threaded on the end, and this is a little 10-gram weight that I screw into the very end of the Tonearm, and that allows me to move this heavy counterweight much closer to the pivot. The other thing, if you have nothing screwed into the end of this Tonearm tends to resonate, and that helps deaden it. So if you're not going to put any weight out here on the end, you should at least, and I'll try to find and put the link below, the company makes it's got a little rubber washer, and it's a little, nylon screw thing that you screw into the end of the Tonearm, and that helps reduce the resonance of the Tonearm. The same people make a little weight setup that's got multiple different sizes, so you can fine-tune the relationship where this counterweight is in relation to the pivot. I think I've got this one in a really nice place that I'm happy with, and so that's something to consider. I also think these little weights that you put here help. It's not a lot, but I think it just helps kind of dampen and keep the vinyl up against the platter. Don't have to get some fancy one that's had, pixie fairy dust or was carved by elves in the Black Forest. Just get a little Hudson Hi-Fi one or whatever you can find. So there we are on that point. The next thing is how to set up the cartridge. I'm a big fan of these Baerwald arc protractors. You can get these off Vinyl Engine. It's a little different than what Technics has you set them up as. Techniques setup would move the cartridge a few millimeters further back in the head shell and be perfectly straight. Whereas if you use this arc protractor to meet this arc and to get this alignment on these 2 points, you have to move the cartridge out almost to the end of the head shell and then toe it in just a little bit till it lines up with these grids. And you want the cantilever to line up with these grids. Now, the cartridge that this turntable comes with, the offset or the overhang between the screws and the needle doesn't allow the use of this setup without replacing the head shell. So if you've got one of these cartridges that comes with this turntable and you want to upgrade the needle and not change the cartridge, you're either going to have to replace the head shell that's got longer slots and could end up heavier and could cause some issues to get it set up like this, or just set it up the way Technique says. You'll be giving up a little bit of bass response from me trying the 2 different setups and listening to them, but it still sounds nice. VM540ML, I think, rocks with this turntable. It allows you to get the right overhang, to get this set up without having to change the head shell, even though I did go with this nice wood one. And it's just a really crisp sounding nice cartridge, especially for a moving magnet, and you don't get into all the complication of a moving coil, needing a step-up transformer, or having a phono stage that's got super high amplification and the issues that could cause. So the last thing I want to touch on is, how do I protect my vinyl? I've got this nice vinyl, and like every time I pull it out of the sleeve, it's got paper dust all over it. It's a mess. Buy some of these MoFi inner liners. They're not expensive. These are what, if you buy some of those high-end MoFi vinyl records, this is what they put theirs in. And it's supposed to help with the static. They're just these little clear vinyl things. You open them up, you put them in there. Archival, no scratching, anti-static. I mean, if you care about your records, put them in some nice sleeves. Now, if the vinyl comes with a inner sleeve that has this kind of, slick plastic kind of liner inside the paper thing, those are probably fine. You don't need to, replace them with these MoFi ones. But if it's got just the generic little paper ones, put them in a good sleeve. The last thing I'm going to touch on is cables. And I know there's a lot of snake oil in audio cables, but in phono use, it does matter. And not so much the quality, but the capacitance of the cables. And a lot of the really high-end RCA cables have really high capacitance too, which is horrible for a turntable. If you look at the manufacturer of your cartridge, it'll specify the PF loading and the resistance loading that the cartridge wants to see. Now, the resistance loading is set up by your phono stage or your phono preamp, whichever one you want to call it, but the capacitance is mostly set up by the cables. And there's going to be some capacitance in the cables going through the Tonearm. And then, like on this turntable, it's got RCA jacks that go out to your amplifier or phono stage or whatever. And those cables are going to have some capacitance. Now, the little skinny, kind of cheap looking cables that these turntables come with, they have really low capacitance. And I have this little meter here that I use to scientifically test these cables to make sure that I was within the PF loading that the cartridge recommended. Now, I'm a big fan of these World's Best cables that they sell on Amazon, but you have to be careful there. Some of those have a pretty high PF capacitance in them. and even looking at the specs on them can be confusing. They might say they're 20 PF per meter or something like that, but that's not necessarily what happens when they're installed as a cable and you check the cable. And I got some that I thought were going to be really low capacitance, and they ended up being like 240 PF, which is outside the range that this cartridge is going to work well with. And so then I found a pair of those that were, they claim were like the lowest PF cables on the market, and I think they were 130 PF or 120, which is fine. You want to stay between 100 and 200 PF. Now, a lot of people think that means you need to set the phono stage, because some phono stages have switchable capacitances. That's adding on top of your cables. So, if you don't have a way to measure your cables, you need to turn that off and just set it to 0. Because there's likely enough capacitance in your cables unless your cartridge is looking for fairly high capacitance. And again, you have to look up the manufacturer's spec. Now, one of these little meters that's accurate enough to do this, they're probably $150. And so, I use it for other things, but, it was helpful for me to be able to see, took the head shell off, hooked the cables up to the turntable, put it on the other end, and that's going to measure the RCA cables and the wiring inside the Tonearm, and it was under 200 PF, so I was good. So I'll link those below too, but just be careful about swapping in just any old RCA cables, or if you're not sure, just use the ones that came with your turntable, and if they don't look great, they're going to be better than putting some really high capacitance cables in that are just going to kill the high frequency response of your turntable. So anyway, I think that kind of covers round 2 of carrying feeding of your turntable and your vinyl. Hope you've enjoyed this video. If you have, please subscribe to the channel. Please like the video. Thanks to you Patreon supporters, to you other folks that have made donations at my website. Really appreciate it. And until next time, have a nice day.